So I was looking at the calendar for May, and obviously, the 5th stands out. In the U.S., it is just this massive cultural juggernaut.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got the margarita specials, the inflatable cacti, just the sheer commercial volume of it all.
Yeah.
And for years, I just assumed, like probably 90% of the people at those bars, that we were celebrating Mexican Independence Day.
It feels like the logical answer, doesn't it?
It really does. But then I actually looked up the real date for Mexican independence, and it's September 16th.
Right. And it started way back in 1810.
Which puts a solid 50-year gap between the actual Independence Day and whatever happened on Cinco de Mayo.
A huge gap.
Right. So we're not celebrating the birth of a nation. We're celebrating something else entirely. And the more I, dug into the sources you sent over, the more I realized that the common knowledge about this holiday is almost entirely wrong.
It's not just that people have the date wrong. I mean, that's part of it. But the bigger thing is that the holiday itself might actually be more American than it is Mexican.
That's the paradox, isn't it?
That is the paradox at the heart of this. If you go to Mexico City or Guadalajara on May 5th, it's basically a normal Tuesday. Schools might be open. Banks are open.
It's a minor observance.
A very minor one. But here in the United States, it's a phenomenon. And the reason for that discrepancy isn't just marketing. It's rooted in the U.S. Civil War.
Wow.
The story we're diving into today is about how a single battle in Mexico, fought in mud and rain, might have actually saved the United States from permanent division.
That is a massive claim. So we're connecting a party in a stylized Mexican bar to the survival of the Union in the 1860s.
That's the line we're going to draw.
Okay, so to get there, though, we need to set the stage. Because in 1861, Mexico was not having a good time.
Not having a good time is a very charitable way to put it. Mexico was in free fall.
Okay.
They had just wrapped up the War of Reform, which was this brutal 3-year civil war between liberals and conservatives. The liberals, led by Benito Juarez, technically won, but they inherited a graveyard. The infrastructure was smashed, the population was divided, and most importantly for our story, the treasury was empty.
I saw the term erario publico in the notes.
Yes, the public treasury. It was insolvent. I mean, there was literally no money to run the government, let alone pay off the massive foreign debts that previous administrations had racked up.
So what does Juarez do?
Well, in July of 1861, President Juarez makes a call that changes everything. He issues a decree suspending payments on all foreign debt for 2 years.
Which, to be fair to Juarez, sounds a bit like a Chapter 11 bankruptcy situation.
It does.
He wasn't saying, I'm never paying you. He was saying, look, we need to keep the lights on so we can stabilize the country, and then we will pay you.
That was the argument. But the creditors, specifically Spain, England, and France, they didn't see it as a restructuring. They saw it as theft.
I can imagine.
And the response was immediate. In October 1861, these 3 superpowers signed the Convention of London.
Which was what, exactly?
It was essentially a debt collection alliance.
A repo squad with a navy.
Exactly. They agreed to send a joint fleet to Mexico, seize the customs houses, basically the ports where all the tariff money came in, and force Juarez to pay up.
But even before they landed, the math was suspicious. I was looking at the debt breakdown. England was owed something like 60 million pesos.
Roughly, yes. Spain was owed about 9 million. And France...
This is the part that jumps out. France was only owed 2 million pesos.
A pittance in national terms, a rounding error.
So England has the most to lose. But as the fleets arrive and the negotiations start, it becomes pretty obvious that the country with the smallest debt, France, is the one acting the most aggressive.
That's where the alliance just fell apart. The British and Spanish representatives, they were there for the money.
Right.
They wanted their cash, but they had no interest in a long, drawn-out war in the Americas. They started noticing that the French troops weren't acting like debt collectors.
They were acting like an invasion force.
Exactly. They were making demands that went way beyond financial restitution.
The French had a hidden agenda.
It wasn't even that hidden after a while. Napoleon III, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte, had what he called a grand design.
Oh, wait.
And once the British and Spanish realized they were just being used as cover for a French imperial expansion, they cut separate deals with Juarez, packed up their ships, and went home.
They left France standing there alone.
Which is exactly what Napoleon III wanted. He didn't care about the 2 million pesos. He wanted Mexico.
But this is where the timing gets incredibly suspicious.
Right.
Why 1862? Why try to conquer Mexico right then?
Because the watchdog was asleep?
Meaning?
The Monroe Doctrine. For decades, that had been U.S. policy, basically saying, Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Under normal circumstances, if France landed an army in Veracruz, the United States would have sent troops to stop them.
But in 1862,
The United States was busy tearing itself apart.
the Civil War.
Precisely. The Union was paralyzed. They couldn't spare a single regiment to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon III saw this window of opportunity.
And his goal was to install a puppet monarchy.
A puppet monarchy in Mexico to act as a buffer state against U.S. expansion. He was terrified of the American manifest destiny consuming the whole continent.
But it goes darker than just stopping expansion, doesn't it? There's a direct link to the Confederacy here.
This is the critical piece. You have to understand, Napoleon III was sympathetic to the Confederate cause.
Really?
His plan was to conquer Mexico, install a friendly Emperor Maximilian, and then use Mexico as a supply line and a diplomatic ally for the Confederate States of America.
So wait, if France succeeds quickly,
If they succeed quickly, they could recognize the South as a legitimate nation, trade weapons for cotton across the Rio Grande, and effectively ensure that the United States remains permanently split in two.
wow. So for the Union, this wasn't just some foreign war next door. This was a potential back door for the Confederacy to survive.
A direct threat.
And while we're on the topic of Napoleon III's branding, I have to bring up something that blew my mind in the research. The term Latin America. I use it on census forms. I use it in conversation. I had no idea it came from him.
It is one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history. Before this period, the region was usually referred to as Spanish America or Hispanic America.
Right.
But Napoleon III needed a way to justify why France, a European power, had a right to intervene there. So his intellectuals coined the term Latin America to create this linguistic bond.
Because they both speak Romance languages derived from Latin.
Right. It was an attempt to create a Latin-lead Pan-Latinism. He was positioning France as the natural leader of the Latin peoples against the Anglo-Protestant culture of the United States.
It was ideological warfare.
It absolutely was. He was trying to say, we aren't invaders. We are your Latin cousins saving you from the Americans.
That is wild. We're still using the propaganda term of a 19th century French emperor.
Yeah.
So, okay, the British and Spanish leave. The French are alone, and they start marching inland toward Mexico City. And the mood in the French camp.
Hubris, absolute unchecked arrogance. You have to remember, the French army of this era was considered the finest military machine on the planet. They were veterans of the Crimea, of campaigns in Italy and North Africa. They were disciplined, well-fed, and heavily armed.
And leading them is the Count of Lorenzes.
Yes. And Lorenzes writes a letter to the French Minister of War that historians still cite as just the peak of delusion.
What'd he say?
He wrote essentially, we are so superior to the Mexicans in race, in organization, in discipline, and in morality that I am already master of Mexico.
I am already master of Mexico. He hadn't even fought the main battle yet.
He hadn't. He genuinely believed the Mexicans would just roll over. He'd been listening to conservative Mexican exiles in Paris who told him the people were desperate for a monarchy. He did not expect a fight.
But standing in his way at the city of Puebla is General Ignacio Zaragoza. And looking at the matchup, I mean, I can see why Lorenzes was so confident. The Mexican army looks scrappy.
Scrappy is an understatement. Zaragoza had about 4,000 to 5,000 men. It was a mix of veterans from the Reform War and hastily conscripted indigenous militias from the surrounding mountains.
Wow.
They were poorly fed and their equipment was a hodgepodge. We know they had some modern rifles, Enfields, and Mississippi rifles left over from the U.S.-Mexican War, but many were armed with antiquated muskets or just farm tools.
So, May 5th, 1862. The French arrive at Puebla. And because Lorenzes is so sure of himself, he doesn't do the smart military thing, right? He doesn't circle the city.
No, he ignores his own engineers. Puebla was defended by two forts on elevated hills, the Fort of Laredo and the Fort of Guadalupe.
Okay.
Any rational commander would have besieged them or tried to cut off their water. Lorenzes orders a direct frontal assault.
Straight up the hill.
Straight up the hill. He sends his elite Zouave troops, these guys with the baggy red trousers and turbans, the shock troops of the French army, straight into the teeth of the Mexican defenses.
And that is when the weather turns.
The timing was cinematic. As the battle raged, a massive storm broke over the valley. We are talking torrential rain, thunder, and hail.
So the battlefield turns to mud.
The slopes of the hills, which were already steep, turned into a mudslick. The French soldiers, with their heavy packs and precision formation, started slipping and sliding. They couldn't get traction. They became slow-moving targets for the Mexican shooters in the forts.
And when they finally got close enough for hand-to-hand combat, they ran into something they weren't trained for. The sources mentioned the psychological impact of the Mexican militias.
This is the visceral reality of the battle. The French were used to bayonet drills,
Right.
but the indigenous militias from the Zacapoxtla region weren't using bayonets, they were using machetes.
Oh, wow.
These are heavy agricultural blades meant for hacking through sugarcane or thick brush.
Ugh.
In close quarters, against men stuck in the mud, the machete is a terrifying weapon.
It's brutal, intimate violence. It's not shooting from 100 yards away.
Exactly. The ferocity of that defense just shocked the French. They were expecting a disorganized rabble, and instead they found men fighting for their homes with absolute desperation.
And then the Mexicans counterattack.
Just as the French lines were wavering, a young general named Porfirio Diaz, who would later become the dictator of Mexico for 30 years, but here he is, the hero led a cavalry charge that flanked the French.
And the master of Mexico had to run.
Lawrence says was humiliated. The French army broke and retreated all the way to the coast. It was the first time the French army had been defeated in almost 50 years.
So huge victory, huge morale booster. But here is where we need to be the buzzkills of history. Because I think this is where the misconception lies. People assume this battle kicked the French out of Mexico for good, but it didn't.
No, not at all. And this is why it's not Independence Day. The French lost the battle, but they were a superpower.
So Napoleon III just doubles down.
He didn't quit. He poured resources in. He sent 30,000 more troops and a new commander. They came back to Puebla a year later, in 1863, and they besieged it for 2 months until the Mexicans ran out of food and ammunition.
So Puebla fell.
Puebla fell. Then Mexico City fell. Juarez had to flee north, effectively running the government out of a black carriage, which you can still see in a museum today.
So the French did win. They installed Maximilian as emperor. They held the country for years. So if they lost the capital anyway, why does the victory at Puebla even matter? Why are we still talking about it?
Because in war, time is the most valuable resource.
Okay.
The Battle of Puebla delayed the French occupation of Mexico City by exactly 1 year. And that year, from May 1862 to May 1863, was the most critical window of the U.S. Civil War.
Because in early 1862, the Union looked like it might actually lose.
The Union was struggling badly, but by the summer of 1863, the tide was turning. You have Gettysburg, you have Vicksburg. The Union war machine was finally ramping up. Because the French were bogged down in Mexico, licking their wounds from Puebla, they couldn't intervene in the U.S. during that moment of weakness. They couldn't send guns to the Confederacy or recognize their sovereignty because they were too busy trying to fix their own disaster in Mexico.
So by the time the French finally set up shop in Mexico City, the moment to help the Confederacy had passed.
It had passed. And once the U.S. Civil War ended in 1865, the game was over for France.
How so?
The U.S. government, now reunified and possessing a massive battle-hardened army, turned to Napoleon III and said, "Get out."
And he had other problems.
At the same time, Prussia was threatening France and Europe. Napoleon III cut his losses. He withdrew the troops in 1867, leaving poor Maximilian behind to face a firing squad.
It really is a story of unintended consequences. But let's bring this home to the listeners in the U.S. We've established why the battle mattered geopolitically. But how did it become a holiday here? Because I have a hard time believing that folks in 1862 Chicago were super invested in Puebla.
No, probably not. But folks in California were. And this is the origin story that most people miss.
Okay.
In 1862, the American West California, Nevada, Oregon, had a large Mexican-American population. And they were watching these two wars happen simultaneously.
The one in Mexico and the Civil War.
Right. They saw the French invasion of their ancestral homeland and the Confederate rebellion in their new home as the same fight.
Freedom versus slavery, republic versus monarchy.
Yes. You have to remember, the Confederacy had actually claimed the Arizona territory. They had designs on the West. So for Latinos in California, hearing that the French had been beaten at Puebla was electrifying. It wasn't just news from the old country.
It was a victory for their cause here.
A victory for the cause of freedom in the Americas.
So they celebrated.
Immediately. The research shows that as soon as the news arrived, which took weeks, of course, Latinos in towns like Columbia, California, fired gun salutes and sang patriotic songs.
What?
They formed organizations called Juntas Patrioticas, Patriotic Assemblies. These weren't party planning committees, they were political organizations. They raised money to send to Juarez, they held rallies, and crucially, they paraded with both the Mexican flag and the U.S. flag.
That imagery is so important. It wasn't a Mexican celebration. It was a dual identity celebration.
Exactly. It was a statement that said, we are Americans, we are Mexicans, and we stand against imperialism and slavery. That is why Cinco de Mayo took root in the U.S. West in a way it never did in Mexico.
So in Mexico, it's a battle anniversary.
A battle anniversary. In the U.S., it became a civil rights marker. It was sustained by these juntas patrioticas for decades, keeping the memory alive as a symbol of resistance.
So the modern commercialization, the beer ads, the party vibe, that's all a layer of paint on top of something much more substantial.
It is. The commercialization came much, much later in the 1980s, when beer companies realized they could market to the Hispanic demographic. But the bones of the holiday are deeply serious. It's about a moment when the future of North America was incredibly uncertain.
It really makes you rethink the whole margarita holiday stereotype. Next time I'm out on May 5th, I'm going to have a very different appreciation for what's going on.
You should.
It's not just about a party, it's about a geopolitical pivot point.
And honestly, it's a great reminder of how interconnected our history is. You can't tell the story of the U.S. Civil War without talking about Mexico, and you can't tell the history of modern Mexico without the U.S. context.
I want to leave the listeners with a final thought to chew on. We talk a lot about the butterfly effect,
Okay.
but this is more like the machete effect.
I like that.
If it hadn't rained that day in Puebla,
Yeah.
if Lawrence Says had been a little less arrogant and just flanked the city, the French take Mexico City in 1862. They open supply lines to the Confederacy. Maybe the Union is forced to negotiate a peace. We could be looking at a map today with the Confederate States of America and a French-controlled Mexican empire.
It is a sobering what if. The world we live in was shaped by the mud on that hill.
And on that note, thanks for helping us decode the truth behind the holiday.
Always a pleasure to dig into the archives.
And to everyone listening, thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.